966.
How I want to do this, Richard, if this is cool with you, is I was looking into the Saudi Iran thing. We've had just so much good stuff on it recently, but it just sort of hit me how quickly everything's happening. So I wanted to kind of go through and just put the timeline out there of everything that's happened in the last, 5 weeks, which is a ton. And it not just represents a change of Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran, but a total reset in the region. So, and Richard, you and I were both there at the time when we heard this. March 6, 2023 was the announcement of the deal brokered by China. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but that was sort of a shock. That was a surprise. The word surprise and shock is used all the time, Richard, in news. And so, like you said, we're in the weed with a lot of this stuff. Sometimes we're just like, that's not surprising at all. But that was surprising. And this was a surprising development. And then March 24th, very fateful day for the Saudi-Iran relationship. A little podcast called the 966, probably have heard of it, did a special episode with 3 guests to talk about the agreement and what it means from a variety of viewpoints and perspectives. And I keep thinking about those 3 conversations because all of them, 4 weeks later, are very salient, and they all sort of took a longer view of what was happening. So moving forward, April 6th, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein
Good luck with this one.
Amir Abdollahian, Hossein A,
Yeah,
and his Saudi counterpart, Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, met in Beijing. This was last Thursday, April 6th, for their first formal diplomatic engagement in over 7 years. So that is a huge deal. And then the momentum continued, Richard. Last Saturday, April 8th, Saudi delegation. They called it a technical delegation. I think that was just, to highlight the fact that it was not as super high level, but went to Tehran to discuss reopening its diplomatic missions in the Islamic Republic. They met, among others, Iran's chief of protocol, Mehdi Honardust, at the foreign ministry in Tehran. Richard, I got to beef up on my Persian names. I've got no experience at all. I'm really sorry for all our listeners.
I like the Mehdi. I like the first name, last name, initial.
Hussein A. Like it's their gamer handle.
Exactly.
Anyway, so that was Saturday. Thursday, you've got this high level meeting. Saturday, you have the Saudi delegation going to Tehran. 2 days later, Monday, April 10th, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to restore flights between their countries and resume government and private sector visits. 2 days later, we're seeing a really good 2-day tempo here. Wednesday, April 12th, yesterday or 2 days ago, for those listening to this podcast when we publish on Friday morning and 7 a.m. Riyadh time, a delegation of Iranian diplomats arrived in Riyadh on Wednesday. Similar talks about reopening the Iranian embassy. And Richard, not just talks about opening the Iranian embassy. Reuters had a photo of the gates of the Iranian embassy in Saudi Arabia physically reopening, for the first time in 7 years. If you go online, we're not going to show it on the podcast because I don't have time to write Reuters and ask for their permission to use it. But if you just go online and Google it, it's kind of stark. It's a shocking thing because there's this dude just sliding open the gate and you kind of imagine it just being totally empty for the last 7 years. Who knows what they're going to find in that embassy, especially in the kitchen. I don't know. But yeah, so as I mentioned, this will publish, Richard, this podcast Friday morning, 7 a.m. Riyadh time, as it always does on April 14th. At this clip, I feel like we might have some new news that makes all this older, like Iran is going to join Saudi Arabia's bid for the World Cup or something like that. And just wow, things are really warming up. But I feel like this timeline is useful because when this was announced, we were like, whoa, okay, so they got 2 months. Is this going to happen? Let's talk about it. What does this mean? And then, 2 weeks, 3 weeks go by and stuff's really happening quickly. And that's kind of surprising to me. You see these things and you're sort of saying, man, they're really doing what they say they're going to do here. And then Richard, just wanted to add to this as part of the context. This is not just happening in a vacuum, this Saudi-Iran deal. It's part of a larger shift for Saudi Arabia on the foreign policy front. And again, things are moving fast here. And it's really a huge reshuffle. It's like a total reset. Interested in your thoughts on that in a bit, but I think this period is going to be studied as significant. No matter what happens next. This deal, the Saudi-Iran deal, has first and foremost serious implications for Yemen, which we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast, but that's where Saudi Arabia and Iran were really in the most direct conflict as far as the Cold War goes between them. Saudi Arabia is recalibrating its relationship with other regional and global powers as well. Let's look at some of those. A delegation headed by Syria's foreign minister arrived in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday, yesterday, for bilateral talks. This is the first time this has happened since 2012. Kind of had a warm greeting from him, from the Deputy Foreign Minister Walid Al Khureji. I don't know if the Arab League as a whole is too excited about Syria rejoining it. That I was reading today, Richard, and we included something in our newsletter about this. There's some holdouts on Syria. Looking at Lebanon, you have hopes there that the Saudi-Iran deal might have some strong implications for the sad situation going on with the government there. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia continues to enhance its ties with Pakistan. You have Iraq growing closer to the GCC as well over the past few years after 2 decades of having really bad relations, obviously, since the U.S. invaded Iraq. Of course, you have Saudi Arabia. Outside of Saudi Arabia, there's an announcement of restoration of diplomatic ties between Bahrain and Qatar. It just, all this looks more real, and it's a tectonic shift happening in the region. At first we were saying, well, maybe not an earthquake, but a tremor. And it's like, you can't really look at a bilateral relationship or the whole region as a whole without seeing how it might change from this Saudi-Iran deal. So it's my one big thing. Kind of all over the place, but just wanted to kind of wrangle together these sort of threads that seem to be connected.
I think that's a good one. And I think it adds to the canon on the 966 of segments devoted to diplomatic initiatives coming out of Saudi Arabia. We've done a number of them. Mm-hmm. And we take it all the way back, and I think you did the timeline, but I think we could take it back to January 2021 and the Al Ula Declaration, when they basically Saudi Arabia ended its dispute with Qatar. Now we see that other countries, Bahrain is, I think UAE is the last one now not to have diplomatic, or not to, it's still at issue. Bahrain and Qatar, that's a big deal. So, but anyway, from Saudi perspective, you can see them lining them up and knocking them down in terms of better diplomatic relations. I mean, there was Qatar first, there was Turkey, there's improved relations with Iraq, there's Iran, and now Syria. And as you say, there's going to be some pushback. Morocco, Kuwait, Qatar aren't super excited about this. But nonetheless, Syria is clearly coming in from the cold. And whether it happens quickly or, over in stages, it's going to happen in terms of the Arab world. And so we've, like you say, we've tracked this and we've seen this, and it was a clear decision by the Saudis that the antagonistic relationships that had arisen, and particularly with Iran, but also, beginning with Qatar, which is a problem, was not helpful. And so they've gone about cleaning up these antagonistic relationships. Now, I'm less sanguine, I'm less optimistic about the Iranian agreement. I think it's a good move. I think it's, we have to remember Saudi Arabia and Iran have had good relations, diplomatic relations anyway, for the most part, except for interludes. Obviously this one going back to 2016. There have been other, cuts and when the relationships have been severed, but then they come back, and they're not necessarily warm and friendly, but they're operable. What Saudi Arabia, as we know, wants out of this is Iran to get out of the way, or at least be helpful of a full resolution in Yemen. And we've talked about this before, Saudi Arabia really doesn't want to be collateral damage in a Iranian-Israeli or Iranian-US-Israeli firefight. So if they can accomplish those two things, it's a huge win for Saudi Arabia. I don't see, as we've said before, and I think I mentioned on the show, ultimately, if you want to, Saudi Arabia wants to defuse the region in its entirety or in a broader scope. That specifically has to, in terms of the relationship with Iran, that would have to address their non-state proxies, the ones they have in Lebanon, the ones they have in Palestine, the ones they have in Iraq and Yemen, and those are tools that Iran is not going to give up easily. and in large part because they're asymmetric counters to the U.S. and the West, regardless of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, I think, is going, well, we're not going to worry about those right now, but if we can get real movement on Yemen and real movement on getting out of the path of destruction of potential Israeli Iranian encounter, then that's a huge win. I don't think the Iranians are going to change their spots, but certainly a lot of what's going on in the region by all part players, Saudi Arabia in particular, is hedging their bets with regard to the U.S. And Iran obviously was already in the China camp and the Russia camp. They love that this the relationship with Saudi Arabia is at the expense of the U.S. in their minds. This renewed diplomatic relations. So this is all good in terms of marginalizing the U.S. as much as possible in the U.S. because it's been their number one goal for many years, as well as the Russians and in large the Chinese as well. Less so the Chinese, but certainly the Russians. So anyway, you're really timely and good. But since we've been tracking it, we see this arc, and we sort of understand. We think we understand the reasons why. Again, I'm less optimistic about full-blown flowering of Saudi-Iranian relations, just because I think Iran has so many other priorities in other countries and concerns that they can only go so far.
Yeah, really, really good, Richard. The one thing I kind of wanted to add to that is basically the only thing that happens from this is you reestablish some embassies, they start talking with each other, and then the situation in Yemen gets resolved because they're able to talk to each other, hammer out the finer points of the ceasefire, get the U.S. involved. Tim Lenderking's on his way there now, probably there now. But if that's the only thing that comes out of this, that is huge. That's been one of the biggest tragedies of all of foreign policy in the entire world in the last decade has been the situation in Yemen. If they can figure out a peaceful solution there, move forward, start getting people the aid they need, help rebuild the economy, which will take a long time. If they can do that, and then they're just talking to each other and it's not a bromance, but it's just, hey, like, I recognize that you're there. And if you need anything, pick up the blower and call me and we can figure it out. If that's what we're looking at here, that's a massive step forward. So I'm hopeful on that. And again, this is additional to what I was talking about, but there was a lot going on in Yemen this week. You had a delegation from Oman and Saudi Arabia go to Yemen, into the Houthi controlled capital, and say, hey, we're working on an extension of this deal for a year after a 6-month extension of it. There isn't a formal ceasefire in place anymore. It expired, but people have held to it. I think that gives a lot of momentum to it. And so, Ambassador Mohammed Al-Jaber, who made the comments on Twitter, I always love that when they're just a huge official announcement and somebody just tweeting on a phone, I'm visiting Sana'a. If that's what we can get out of this and everything else stays the same, it's not a completely peaceful and calm region, but that's big. I mean, that's nice.
It's huge.
So, yeah.
It's huge. And that's number one on the Saudi reasons for doing this, in my opinion.
Yeah,
it's huge. It'd be a great get. I'm just saying that, this is sunshine and rainbows right now, and it's wonderful. It's nice, and these are good things. But there are fundamental differences between Iranian national priorities and Saudi national priorities, but that's the whole point of diplomacy, is to come together where you can and try to avoid conflict and potential, explosion of areas where you don't agree.
Yes.
And when you're talking, it's a lot better than when you're not.
Yeah. Look at the U.S. and China, and the U.S. and Russia. Couldn't be a bigger adversarial relationship, but the two sides talk. There's still embassies in both capitals. Just the way diplomacy works. You talk. So, Great point.